Cuchulainn, who is equivalent of Fenrir and Vishnu, has also been shown to be a parallel of Greek Ares in my Cuchulainn videos. Ares, besides having the interrupted affair with the fire god's wife, in similar form to that of Cuchulainn with the wife of Mannanon, the fire god, is also an infamously chained god. There was an archaic Spartan statue of Ares in chains in the temple of Enyalios, who was sometimes regarded as the son of Ares, sometimes as Ares himself, a theme we find also with Vrika, son of Varaha, for instance, who is the one who gets bound like Fenrir or Cuchulainn, and who thus seems to be an extension of his father, Varaha Vishnu. As Wikipedia summarizes, quote, "Instructions given by an oracle of the late Hellenistic era to various cities of Pamphylia in Anatolia, including Saedra, Lycia, and Cilicia, each was told to set up a statue of bloody man-slaying Ares, and provide it with an annual festival in which it was ritually bound with iron fetters," quote, "by Dike and Hermes," unquote, as if a supplicant for justice put on trial and offered sacrifice. The oracle promises that, quote, "Thus will he become a peaceful deity for you, once he has driven the enemy horde far from your country, and he will give rise to prosperity much prayed for," unquote, unquote. One wonders if a Spartan sacrifice of puppies or dogs to Enyalios, which is reported by Pausanias, could tie back to something similar to Cuchulainn killing the hound of Culann in order to become the hound himself, if Enyalios is indeed connected to the same deity at root. But my thesis is that the Vishnu type often has multiple aspects. Just as in Vedic tradition, Vishnu is well known for his numerous avatars appearing with their own branches of a sprawling yet connected mythos. Thus, in other branches like the Greek, it would not be surprising to find more than one god who aligns with Vishnu myths. This does indeed seem to be the case, in particular with the god turned anti-god, Typhon. Remember, although Ares retains a chained motif and ritual connection, he lacks any clear myth paralleling Fenrir or the more rampaging aspects of Cuchulainn and Vishnu. Typhon, on the other hand, has many of them. Let's take a look. If you watch our Vishnu and Fenrir myth stream in 2 parts on this channel, you will notice that Arno suggests at one point how Typhon could be a Greek parallel of the Fenrir-type mythos, the Cuchulainn-type mythos. I found this an interesting suggestion, but was admittedly skeptical at first, due to outward differences in Typhon. But Arno noted how Zeus is the Mitra type, Zeus being Typhon's opponent, and how Typhon challenges the gods and cuts the sinews of Zeus's hands in this fight, similar to what happens to Tyr and Lugith. This was a good case for further investigation. From there, the matches of Typhon to the other Vishnu types really began to add up. All credit to Arno for first making the connection and the initial case for it, as this parallel turns out to be an extremely important link in the chain that then leads to some mind-blowing further parallels in Egypt and Israel. First, it should be clear that Typhon is indeed born a god, a son of Gaia, Mother Earth, or of Hera, and in one version a son of both Hera and Kronos. I'm not sure, but it might be worthwhile to compare their births, which both involve variant fathers, and a conception from a bizarre source that is hidden from the female's husband. When we take into account the variant with Kronos inseminating eggs that are buried and hidden in the ground, found in the Scholiast on Apollonius Rhodius 1.503, with Kronos as a variant father also supported by a mention in the Scholiast on Homer's Iliad 2.783. Avarion, a parallel of Kronos, is also the foster father of Cuchulainn. Now, Typhon is often thought of only or mainly as serpentine. which takes us away from the image of Fenrir or Cuchulainn, the hound, or even Narasimha, the lion man. But actually, Typhon is much less of a simple serpent and much more of a chaotic, multi-animal associated monstrosity, which could then connect back to the deeper Vishnu-type idea of having multiple animal forms that become chaotically intertwined. Vishnu has lion, boar, tortoise, and also fish avatars, with the fish and serpent being similar animals that often are interchanged with each other in symbolism. And he has a son named Vrika, wolf, and indeed he reclines on a cosmic serpent, Shesha. Thus, Vishnu has plenty of animal forms and connections that could link to Typhon as a monstrosity of multiple animal forms, and his reclining on a serpent could obliquely remind us of Typhon having snakes for lower limbs. Typhon is indeed not the simple serpent that Python or Hydra is at all. And in actuality, he is said by Nonus to have many animal heads, including dogs, wolves, and lions, and of course snakes, but the dog, wolf, and lion heads could easily connect to the forms that become more prominent with Narasimha, Fenrir, and Cuchulainn. This could be a matter of different emphasis. Quote, "In addition to snake heads, Nonus also gives Typhon many other animal heads, including leopards, lions, bulls, boars, bears, cattle, wolves, and dogs, which combine to make, quote, the cries of all wild beasts together," unquote, unquote. That is from Wikipedia. And Hesiod also says that his dragon heads emit the voices of bulls, lions, dogs, and serpents alike. Vapor and fire is emitted from Typhon's body when stricken by Zeus's thunder, which could have more to do with the thunderbolt, but this isn't entirely clear, and similar emissions of fire are connected to Typhon in the prophecy of his return, as we will see. From Hesiod's account, we read, quote, "Flame shot forth from the thunder-stricken lord Typhon in the dim rugged glens of the mount when he was smitten. A great part of huge earth was scorched by the terrible vapor and melted as tin melts when heated by men's art in channeled crucibles, or as iron, which is hardest of all things, is shortened by glowing fire in mountain glens and melts in the divine earth through the strength of Hephaestus. Even so, then, the earth melted in the glow of the blazing fire," unquote. From Theogony 863 through 867. In his central myth, Typhon becomes the defiant opponent of the gods when he tries to become the king of Olympus. In this myth, he, according to Apollodorus, grapples with Zeus and then takes the sinews of both arms and legs from Zeus, who is the Mitraic god. This act then being directly similar to Fenrir severing the hand of the Mitraic god, Tyr, and Cuchulainn facing down the entire army of his opponents, before also severing the hand of his Mitraic chief opponent, Lugith, even as he himself is defeated by him. Despite briefly incapacitating Zeus with this act of hand and foot cutting, Typhon too is finally neutralized by his Mitraic opponent, Zeus, who then becomes his captor, as Fenrir is neutralized by Tyr, who becomes his captor after first becoming a threat to the gods and then severing Tyr's hand with his teeth in the struggle to subdue him. Typhon then is connected to the waters by being imprisoned near the waters beneath Mount Etna. There are clear water connections in Vishnu, who is Narayana, dweller in the waters, and Matsya, the fish, as well as Kurma, the tortoise, and something related could be playing out in Typhon's persisting hard by the waters during his captivity in this version. Typhon also has a son Orthrus, who is a hound and a cattle herder, much reminiscent then of the hound and cattle herder Cuchulainn. If Orthrus is an emanation of Typhon himself, as other Vishnu sons like Vrika tend to be continuations of their fathers, then Orthrus's role of cattle herder would be comparable with Krishna and Cuchulainn, who are the prominent cattle herders of their traditions. A connection discussed between them in my previous Cuchulainn video. Typhon is also said to be father of Cerberus, the Hound of Hades, which could be relatable to Fenrir's hinted connection to Garmr, Norse dog of hell. Furthermore, Typhon is said to be the father of the Crommyonian sow, the boar mother of the Caledonian boar, famous for their boar hunts. These might then connect back to the boar avatars we have seen with Vishnu and Nate, Varaha and the boar of 4 Mile. Another child of Typhon happens to be the Nemean lion, perhaps connecting again to the underlying lion aspect of this god type, which appears more prominently in Narasimha. Typhon, like Cuchulainn, is specifically weakened by magical food, which is given to him trickily by a crone goddess. Typhon is said to be given, quote, ephemeral fruits, unquote, by the Moirai, the hag fate goddesses, and this weakens him to then be overcome by Zeus. This is too uncanny, since Cuchulainn is given taboo meat by the Morrigan in crone form, and this specifically weakens him to then be killed by Lugith, the Mitraic direct parallel of Zeus. This is where things become too coincidental, and the pieces really start to fall into place. In another late version, Typhon is tricked into coming out of his lair and making himself vulnerable to attack by the promise of a banquet of fish, at which point Zeus is able to strike and defeat him, an apparent variation of this theme of being tricked and made vulnerable by an offer of food. Krishna similarly is offered poisoned milk by a hostile supernatural hag, the demoness Putana, but this is when he is a child, and though he drinks the poisoned milk, he also neutralizes it. Terrible devouring jaws are the prominent feature in the prophecy of the eventual breaking free of Typhon's fury, and this is similar then to the description of Fenrir's famously wide jaws. Fenrir who is also foretold to break free and wreak destruction in the end times. We read in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, quote, "There one day shall burst forth rivers of fire, with savage jaws devouring the level fields of Sicily, land of fair fruit," unquote. Although these are not Typhon's jaws in a literal sense, the fire seems to be an extension of him, and it is the jaws of the fire he sends forth that are said to be savage and devouring and breaking free, like to those of Fenrir. They will destroy the land as Fenrir also will devour indiscriminately, and it should be recalled that the rampaging Narasimha is also specifically the most fiery of Vishnu's forms, and described with wide jaws himself. And so the fire jaws sent forth by Typhon seem to remind of that fiery Narasimha-like potential as well. In Nonnus's version, amid the battle with Zeus, Typhon is said to grow enraged, and he is said to unleash devastation upon the world, his many animal heads each devouring animals of its own kind. Rivers are turned to dust by his fiery heat, seas made dry land, and the land, quote, laid waste, unquote. This then ties back again to the burning Tejas of Vishnu and the snow melting of Cuchulainn. As Cuchulainn is bound to a pillar stone, Typhon is instead imprisoned underground, quote, beneath the roots, unquote, of Mount Etna. Pillar and mountain are both well-known symbols of Axis Mundis, however, and are somewhat interchangeable. Thus, these can be read as equivalent events. We read from Wikipedia, quote, "In one poem, Pindar has Typhon being held prisoner by Zeus under Etna, and in another says that Typhon, quote, lies in dread Tartarus, unquote, stretched out underground between Mount Etna and Cumae. In Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, a hissing Typhon, his eyes flashing, withstood all the gods, but the unsleeping bolt of Zeus struck him, and he was burnt to ashes, and his strength blasted from him by the lightning bolt. And now, a helpless and a sprawling bulk, he lies hard by the narrows of the sea, pressed down beneath the roots of Etna, while on the topmost summit Hephaestus sits and hammers the molten ore," unquote. Notice also how Typhon is here made into the base layer undergirding this Axis Mundi mountain. just as the Vishnu type is the base layer of the Purusha, who is the axis mundi of the cosmos as a whole. Thus, Typhon, lying below the symbolic axis Etna, filled with burning rage that will one day break out again, perfectly fulfills the image of the Vishnu type that I have suggested before. He forms the basis of the cosmos and the Purusha that embodies it. He is the ground of the sacred space that is the world, and he undergirds everything like a restrained nuclear reactor that one day is fated to explode in destructive fury with its wide, fiery jaws. Vishnu even takes the form of the water-dwelling turtle Kurma to support Mount Mandara on his back during the churning of the ocean. This becomes a very similar image to Typhon under the roots of Mount Etna, hard by the narrows of the sea. The Vishnu type also, in one way or another, often finds himself dwelling near or in waters, as I've said, as even Fenrir's name means fen dweller, and one of his chief epithets is monster of the river Van. Cuchulainn has the strange conception from water. Vishnu is Narayana and Matsya and Kurma, and the image of Narayana Vishnu lying on the lotus leaf or the serpent in the waters and emanating Brahma is a variation of the image of Vishnu as the undergirding of Purusha Prajapati, the axis mundi and totality god who embodies the created cosmos. So a god with dog and lion heads, who melts his surroundings with fire that emits from him, who defies the other gods and threatens the Mitraic king of the gods, who cuts the sinews from the hands and feet of that Mitraic god, is weakened by magical food given by a hag goddess, and who is finally neutralized and imprisoned by being made one with an axis mundi symbol, finally also underpinning it, being prophesied to loose his destruction on the world again one day, with a destruction relating to an image of devouring jaws sent out by him, and who just happens to have a son who is a hound cowherd. Hopefully it has become clear that despite the fact that the serpent aspect of Typhon has been emphasized, while the canine or lion aspect has been much more emphasized for the other Vishnu types, we can see that the full structure of the defiant and glory-seeking Makha Vishnu, or perhaps the destructive Narasimha Vishnu type mythos, can be found in the mythos of Typhon, as it certainly does not fully appear with Ares. This parallel also shows once again that one absolutely must understand Zeus as primarily Mitraic in his myths, or large portions of comparative mythology will simply never make sense. See my previous work or the comments of Georges Dumézil in his Mitra Varuna for arguments about why Zeus is Mitra. The descriptions we find of Typhon point back to the fact that this god type is quintessentially a god of so many animal aspects that he can be conceived as a chaotic blend of all of these at once, as Typhon is. Some of these animal forms being extended to his children as well, or as Cuchulainn is in his warp spasm when he is described only as a strange, unheard of thing. Varaha Vishnu also has a moment of similar chaotic blending of Vishnu's other animal forms. This could also relate to the reason for why the boar of 4 Mile is found in the mythic role of the wolf Fenrir, and these two are in the place of Narasimha, more or less. Quote, sometimes the Varahas, boars, turned into Narasimhas, man-lions. Next moment, they took the shape of jackals. Thus, they presented themselves in various terrible forms in the battle which they fought." Unquote. From Kalika Purana 30.91. So, the Varahas are rapidly transforming between boar, lion, and jackal forms in a chaotic blur. This is key to who the Vishnu type is, with his multiple animal forms and Cuchulainn's tendency to furiously warp spasm like an unheard of animal thing, or Typhon's tendency to bellow with the various animal voices, one after the other, or have multiple animal heads at once. It seems that the serpentine association simply became dominant in the representation of this aspect of this Vishnu type for the Greeks, but his other animal aspects could not be entirely forgotten. This confusion of animal forms is also a key link to our next comparison, the Egyptian god Set. The ancients knew the Egyptian god Set was Typhon, though they didn't always explain in detail why. What is impressive in retrospect is that they seem to have been right. If we fixate on the serpentine aspect of Typhon, which is only the surface depiction of what he is, it becomes harder to see the similarities. Yet, if we look beneath this surface level, and if we know the actual details of their myths, we can see that once again, the myths of Typhon and Set are telling essentially similar stories with truly uncanny shared motifs. As just mentioned, the Vishnu type seems to have a theme at its core of chaotically blending or switching between numerous animal forms, or as with Cuchulainn, becoming a, quote, strange unheard of thing, unquote. Is it a coincidence, then, that Set is the god whose animal form has resisted being exactly pinned down by scholars? Only Set's animal form remains a mystery among the gods of the Egyptian pantheon, and at this point in time, scholars have mainly resigned themselves to calling it simply the Set animal, while debating the animal it might have originally been. If it were a chaotic blend between more than one animal, it might explain this situation, or if it were an attempt at rendering a strange, unheard of thing that is similar to a hound, but not quite a common hound, to say the least. For myself, I think the animal looks closest to some sort of canine, as it could have been groomed and clipped in a certain way to give this look, as some scholars have suggested. And in other depictions of Set's animal, it alternately is just a pig, so perhaps a blend of these forms was tried. Either of these options could connect to Vishnu forms. Set even more specifically transforms into a pig in the Book of the Dead, chapter 112. A black pig at that, and this black color could potentially connect back again to the dark coloration we see in Cuchulainn and Krishna. Donald Mackenzie describes an image of the pig Set being bound in chains, again much like Vrika the boar son of Varaha is bound, and like Fenrir is too. Quote, Horus is depicted standing on the back of the pig and piercing its head with a lance. Its legs and jaws are fettered with chains. Unquote. Note that he states that the pig was also a form of Osiris, yet it might be odd to see Horus chaining and lancing his father, of whom he usually is the avenger, though you never know. Mackenzie continues, quote, It was the Set pig, for instance, that fed upon the waning moon, which was the left eye of Horus, unquote. From Egyptian Myth and Legend, chapter 5, by Donald Mackenzie. And this reminds us, for one thing, of the fact that Fenrir's son, also a wolf like his father, is said to devour the moon in the end time. The pig form of Set, then, makes a direct match with one of Vishnu's chief avatars and also the boar of 4 Mile, and happens to match the dark coloration found connected with the Vishnu type. Even the most ancient evidence of Set, which is among the oldest material on any Egyptian god, some of it going back to pre-dynastic times, describes him as a pig, but also as a fish, yet another avatar animal of Vishnu. Quote, Pre-dynastic worship of Set was also evident in the 11th and 9th nomes of Upper Egypt. The standard for the 11th nome is topped by a Set animal, and the name of the main town, Shah-Shattup, supposedly means the pig Set is pacified. And Set was worshipped in his form as a fish in the capital of the 19th nome. Unquote. This is from Ancient Egypt Online, which also notes that pigs were an abomination of Horus, but sacred to Set. Horus's battle with Set, though different from the European Vishnu mythos in some specific ways, still preserves some of the key connections between Set and the other Vishnu types as well. There is an important caveat, which is that it seems likely, as previous scholars have shown, that younger Horus and the elder Horus were originally separate gods with separate myths, who were combined over time, and that the Osiris myth was only linked to the contendings of Horus and Set as part of this late conflation. That is to say, we should not expect the Osiris myth, his dismemberment and resurrection, and the contendings of Horus and Set to parallel a single story in Indo-European parallels, but those aspects might be more broken apart in parallels. Furthermore, Horus the Elder seems to directly parallel the Mitra type, Zeus, Tyr, Lu, etc., but the younger Horus may instead parallel other deities such as Dionysus' son Staphylos, or the Dioscuri, the Ashvins, Freyr, Angus, Pryderi, etc. Typical young sun deities, an issue I have gone into in my book, where I argue that Orion versus Staphylos is more like the Greek version of Set versus the younger Horus, with Dionysus as Osiris, the father of Staphylos, the blinding of Horus switching over to the enemy, who is here Orion. If this is understood, we can see how some parts of Horus and Set's contendings myth do indeed parallel the battle of Zeus and Typhon, as well as the other Mitra versus Vishnu type conflicts we have seen. First is Set's obvious role of defiant antagonist of the gods. This isn't enough on its own to pin Set to the Vishnu type, but it is a good starting point. Set wants to take over the throne of Osiris and become king of the gods, similar to Typhon. Set's chief opponent in his battle for the throne is Horus, who is the direct parallel of Zeus, Mitra, etc. He is the Mitraic sovereign, the late-comer who resolves the cycle of sovereignty in himself and comes to symbolize the totality of divine sovereignty in the world. Numerically, Horus is the 10th god who is added to the 9 gods of the Ennead and completes them. As such, his number 10 recapitulates the original 1, Atum, as Horus is a repetition of the original unity before the dividing of the godhead, but now carried forward and embodied in the world. This is the role of the Mitraic type and of Horus. Horus's animal form is a falcon, and this is very similar to Jupiter's eagle form. In all, Set's opponent is an absolutely viable and strong Zeus parallel, who is the Mitra type, as even Dumasil suggests. This is confirmed when Horus suffers essentially the same loss of limb that Tyr and Lugith, the Norse and Gaelic Mitras, do. During one episode of their contendings, Set attempts to ejaculate into Horus to confirm his dominance of him. Horus catches Set's seed in his hand or hands and takes it to his mother Isis. Isis sees it, grabs a knife, and immediately cuts off Horus's hand or hands. Apparently, translators disagree about whether it is one or both hands that Isis cuts off here, as the original word could be plural or singular. And so some renderings of this passage simply say, quote, hand, parentheses S, to leave it open-ended. Regardless, Horus has at least one hand severed as direct fallout of his battle with Set. Tyr likewise has his hand severed by the Vishnu type Fenrir, and Lugith has his hand severed by the Vishnu type Cuchulainn. This motif of hand loss was so characteristic of Mitra types, in Georges Dumasil's opinion, that he made it a main pillar of the argument of his book, Mitra Varuna. And so we should pay serious heed to the fact that it pops up here, right where we would expect it, if Set were Vishnu and Horus were Mitra. However, as the Dumasil example also showed us, this motif can also sometimes turn out to be a red herring if there is not more to support it. As Dumasil incorrectly connected the hand severing event to Irish Nuada's arm severing and overlooked Lugith's much more similar hand severing by Cuchulainn. As such, we should keep adding support to the picture of Horus and Set. This hand severing of Horus then also parallels the cutting of Zeus's hand and feet sinews by Typhon, and is notably similar to the parallel found in the Iranic Shahnameh, where Jamshid, more of a Yama type, connected to but distinct from Mitra, reaches his hand into the backside of the wolf form of the great destroyer Ahriman to retrieve his brother. When he pulls his hand out, it withers from the toxicity of the wolf's insides. It's fairly clear in this myth how Vishnu too was assimilated into Ahriman by the Zoroastrians. This story is reminiscent of the Set version since it is the toxic potency, even if symbolic, of Set's bodily fluid on the hand that causes Isis to urgently cut off Horus's hand in response. Set's semen has essentially poisoned or made impure the hand or hands of Horus, symbolically threatening his very power to rule and deliver justice. Next is the other most uncanny motif of the Typhon and Cuchulainn stories, which is also shared by the Set story. This is, of course, the undermining of Set following after the deceptive offering of food by a goddess who is trying to help Set's opponent and who trickily offers the food in the semblance of a hag. While Typhon is weakened in order to be defeated by ephemeral fruits given by the Moirai hags, Cuchulainn is weakened by taboo dog meat given by the Morrigan in semblance of a hag. And similarly, Krishna is given poisoned milk by a demoness, though in a very different context. The undermining of Set's right to rule has the same essential motif, but with an extra step. Instead of the tricky food offering directly being offered to Set, Isis instead disguises herself as a hag and offers food to the ferryman, who guards the way to Set. Gaining access to Set in this way, she proceeds to undermine his right to rule by a verbal trick, getting him to condemn his own claim against Horus with his own words. Thus, the food offered, in semblance of a hag, still leads to the undermining of Set, as this undermining is able to happen right after the food grants the hag goddess access. So, the deceptively offered food still is what makes Set vulnerable and leads to his undermining. With the combination of uncanny motifs of hand severing and the disguised hag, whose offer of food leads to the undermining and weakening, the evidence that Set truly is Typhon, and therefore Vishnu, begins to stack up. In the conclusion of the semen episode, Horus tricks Set into eating Horus's seed, which ultimately is one more demerit in the eyes of the gods, leading to Set losing his claim to the throne upon judgment. Therefore, there are technically two motifs of things trickily offered as food in order to undermine Set, and ultimately leading directly to his defeat, and Isis comes up with and sets in motion both of these food tricks. When Horus finally overcomes Set and is proclaimed the victor, Set is brought in chains, echoing Ares in chains, Typhon imprisoned, and Fenrir, Vrika, and Cuchulainn bound or in fetters as well. The Vishnu type is a chained and bound god, and this remains perfectly consistent for Set. An additional uncanny parallel reveals itself. But rather than simply paralleling Typhon, this time we find a parallel that never would have made sense before connecting Vishnu himself to Typhon and then to Set, as we have done. But now that we have the Vishnu parallel in place, this myth of Set suddenly falls perfectly into place as well, as it involves a motif, incredibly, found only in the mythos of Set and the Indian Vishnu himself. What I mean is that in Set's mythos is, uncannily, what looks like a direct parallel of the skinning of Narasimha by Virabhadra, this detail of the mythos not even being conserved in other European branches, but now, incredibly, surfacing in the Egyptian tradition. This is the parallel. Anubis is the other prominent canine god of the Egyptians, who keeps the ordinances of Maat, similar to Rudra's policing of Dharma role, and who is god of mummification and the underworld. This might remind one of how Shiva is at home, dwelling in cemeteries and cremation grounds, and even covers himself in the cremation ash, cremation being a practice that could parallel mummification. We find a Rudra parallel as Lord of the Underworld in the case of Gwyn ap Nudd, and both Odin and Cronus as lords of a special afterlife destination. Thus, the Rudra god type is frequently somehow connected to the afterlife. Meanwhile, Anubis has a key role in the judgment of Egyptian dead, with the famous weighing of the heart. Odin also goes to a judgment seat across Bifrost each day at the Well of Urd. This may or may not be similar. Plutarch makes a surprising and otherwise uninterpretable comment in his On Isis and Osiris when he says, quote, "Some are of the opinion that Anubis is Cronus. For this reason, inasmuch as he generates all things out of himself and conceives all things within himself, he has gained the appellation of dog." Unquote. There is wordplay here that could explain some of this claim, but it is still tantalizing to think there could have been some now lost mystery tradition of Anubis generating all things out of himself, from which Plutarch was drawing an accurate connection between Cronus and Anubis, a connection not elsewhere reported. This is fascinating. Plutarch also states that, quote, "The dog can see with his eyes both by night and by day alike, and among Egyptians, Anubis is thought to possess this faculty, which is similar to that which Hecate is thought to possess among the Greeks, for Anubis is a deity of the lower world as well as a god of Olympus." Unquote. Since we have seen in my Celtic Tantra video how Hecate could possibly be the Greek Kali, who is the female other half of Bhairava Shiva, the fact that Plutarch notes a shared faculty between Hecate and Anubis could further support the possibility of such an underground thread of Anubis mysticism that Plutarch is accurately drawing from, further potentially linking him to Rudraic powers. The Tantric Sadak Rajarshi Nandi has said in an interview that he believes Anubis is the same as his god Bhairava, a form of Shiva, who is attended by and rides upon a dog. The dog is his symbol, and who indeed punishes and forgives sinners while also dwelling in and protecting the cremation grounds, as Anubis also judges the dead and is connected to mummification and the process of death. Bhairava and Virabhadra are perhaps the most prominent Ugra, that is, terrifying, forms of Shiva, and so the fact that Anubis directly parallels Virabhadra in the myth I will describe shows just how closely and how keenly Nandi was able to intuit the similarity between Anubis and the terrible aspects of Shiva generally. So Set, as aforesaid, is defeated by Horus, who then leaves him chained and suppressed, but not killed. Set is said to still thunder in the sky after this. Thus, the killing and skinning of Narasimha, which parallels the end times death of Fenrir, if it appeared in Egyptian myth, would be a separate motif from this defeat by Horus. The correct parallel of Narasimha's skinning emerges when Set decides to transform himself into a jaguar to threaten Osiris, reminiscent of Vishnu taking the lion form Narasimha and then threatening the gods and the cosmos with indiscriminate destruction. To confront this particular threat from Set, Anubis is now the one to step forward. He skins the leopard Set and specifically wears his leopard pelt, exactly as Virabhadra, emanation of Shiva, skins the threatening Narasimha and then wears his pelt ever after in the Linga Purana. So not only is Set skinned and his pelt worn by a strong Virabhadra Shiva parallel, but it is also while Set is specifically in the form of a threatening, predatory feline out of all possible animals he could have turned into, a leopard in this case, making an extremely close parallel to the lion form of Narasimha. All of this is too much when taken together and must make us seriously consider that this motif could go back to a shared origin point between Vedic and Egyptian traditions, or some kind of deep ancient borrowing, if we want to go in that direction, well prior even to the 3000 BCE timeframe we usually look at for Proto-Indo-European unity. It can't be reiterated enough that this myth of Set, skinned by Anubis, would never be interpretable in terms of comparative mythology unless it was understood in the context of the Vishnu-type parallel as we have laid out. But within that context, it makes perfect and uncanny sense. Priests of Anubis took on the pelt of the leopard as a priestly garment as an echo of this myth, giving them a Shiva-like appearance indeed. According to Herodotus, after the defeat by Horus, Set was coincidentally supposed to have been hidden in the Serbonian Marsh, identified with the modern Lake Bardawil in Egypt. This reminds again of the fen-dwelling quality, a fen just like a marsh, indicated in Fenrir's very name, the semi-watery imprisonment of Typhon, and the general water-dwelling connection of Vishnu as Narayana, Matsya, and Kurma. In context, perhaps Set being god of drought and the red desert could then connect back to the burning Tejas of the Vishnu type in his destructive mode, as when Typhon makes rivers turn to dust and generally burns things, turns them into essentially desert. Thus, if we categorize the piercing of Horus's eye and the attack on Osiris as a separate part of the mythos relating to Horus the child, which should be looked at in a different parallel, such as Orion potentially, then we have a clear and full parallel to Typhon and other Vishnu types, with Set. We have the defiant attempt to take the throne of the gods, with the Mitra-type sovereign as his opponent, this opponent ultimately winning out. Set causing the hand severing of his opponent during this struggle. The goddess in semblance of a hag offering food to trickily achieve the vulnerability and undermining of Set. Set being skinned in form of a predatory feline by a Virabhadra parallel, and then Set's pelt being worn by him. A pig form a predatory cat form, a fish form, and a general unheard of animal form that is possibly canine or a mix of animal forms. The conclusion of the conflict with the Mitra-type god, leaving Set chained. Set, like the Vishnu type, despite this contending and rampaging, is also not a pure evil nor a demon. He is instead a key protector. He was a god who was worshipped very much over the course of Egypt's complex history, though not at all times, with some pharaohs even naming themselves after him, such as Seti, meaning man of Set. He is the one who rides on the prow of Ra's boat and defeats the true evil of the Apep serpent. He was looked to for harsh conquest and protection, like Vishnu, the god of conquering space and the defense of sacred space. And the image of Set standing on the prow of the boat of Ra, a god who is conflated with Atum, almost reminds of Cuchulainn, staunchly defending Ulster as warrior of Conchobar, who is equivalent of Atum. Set's power, in a sense, lays the groundwork for the complete sovereign who is Horus. And as Jeremy Nadler argues in his book, Shamanic Wisdom in the Pyramid Texts, Horus must esoterically integrate Set's energy by overcoming him to become perfected as a king. Thus, we can picture Set as the foundation layer of the complete Horus in a similar fashion to Vishnu being the dangerously energetic foundation of the Purusha. Horus defeats Set, but by integrating him, he is partly constituted by him. This is from his discussion of the Pyramid Texts. Quote, Unas, the pharaoh, is able to achieve this healing of the two antagonists because he is embraced by the supreme god Atum, whose very being transcends all opposites. By healing the injuries these two antagonists have inflicted on each other, the king is able to unite fully with the royal Ka energy. It is as if the conflict of Horus and Seth has the effect of locking up and making unavailable this vital energy of the Ka, holding back all further progress until a reconciliation is accomplished. The conflict of these gods can be understood as being waged on the divine, the psychic, and the physical levels. On the divine level, it is a clash of the cosmic forces of generation and destruction. On the psychic level, it is an objective psychic reality that lives within the human soul. And on the physical level, it manifests in the antagonism within the landscape between fertile land and desert. In the human being, Horus represents the aspiration toward spiritual insight, founded on the integration of the energies of the soul, whereas Seth represents the drive of the primitive and elemental forces that, once unleashed, lead to psychic disintegration and spiritual blindness. The resolution of the conflict between these opposing principles in the king has significance both for the divine world and for the whole land of Egypt and its people, because the king's status was such that the effects of his actions ramified through the divine, the human, and the natural realms. Insofar as the Ka energy of the king is released, the land itself is reinvigorated, and this, of course, was one of the objectives of the said festival." Unquote. And referring again to the pharaoh, he says, quote, "Before he can join Ra in his sunboat, he is required to heal and reconcile the opposing forces of Horus and Seth. That is, he is required to bring into harmony the opposites of creativity and destruction, of order, Horus, and the wild, primal, but ultimately unproductive energies of Seth. This reconciliation of the opposites is en route to the union with Ra in his sunboat, a union that occurs initially in the depths of the night. It occurs, in fact, in the depths of the Duat, the realm of Osiris, the realm of death." Utterances 216 to 217. But what this night union with the solar principle entails is the inner rebirth of the king, so that he realizes within himself what the Egyptians termed Akh, AKH. The king becomes Akh, a shining spirit, with power over both life and death, Utterance 217. Thus, by journeying into the realm of death, into the Osirian realm, Pharaoh Unas is able to find new life." Unquote. And finally, quote, "The embrace of the king by the supreme god Atum in Utterance 215 is expressive of a non-dual state that transcends the opposites symbolized by Horus and Seth. This embrace is the prelude to the king's inner identification with Ra, the sun god, in the solar night bark, and his solar rebirth and transfiguration in the Akhet, unquote. We see a direct line between Horus reintegrating Set and uniting with Ra, the sun, as his higher self. A direct line between this and Zeus or Jupiter becoming Sol Invictus, or Lu overcoming the sun god so that he can take and unite with his powers. We see this as a theme in the Mithraic religion as well, and the mysticism that underlies it. Taken together and seen in all its detail, this parallel drives home the fact that the ancients were right this time. They knew exactly what they were talking about when they called Set Typhon, a fact that would have been fairly plain to see to anyone who knew both stories in full, but which the broader Vishnu-type context makes truly convincing for us today. Please check out my Patreon if you would like to support the channel and see all of the important topics I have in mind get made into videos, as well as supporting the completion of my second book, Briochan's Tower, in which many mysteries will be solved. My book, Taliesin's Map, is available from Amazon, link in the description. Make sure to like and subscribe for more, as we map the myths.